Okay, so you see, this has a kind of subjective or human side to it. The truth is what works for us. But it also has a sort of objective side to it, because what works for us doesn't just depend on what we think, it also depends on how the world is. So in some sense it's an attractive idea, and it's one which was developed by other people, like Charles Peirce and another pragmatist called Dewey in the 20th century. So it's been a very influential idea in 20th century philosophy. But there are some notorious problems for pragmatism too. One of them, for example, is that it seems that false beliefs can be useful or expedient. And Blackburn has a nice example of this in his book. He says, look, it may be very useful to believe that you're the most popular person in the class, but surely that doesn't make it true. And going the other way, it can also turn out that lots of things can be true, but utterly useless. I mean, for example, presumably there's a truth about what the cause of the death, what the cause of death of the very last dinosaur was. But what's also presumably true, that it just doesn't matter. It's of no sort of expedient value to us in any way. Here's actually one famous hypothesis that some of you may know. Okay, so there's some attraction to this kind of pragmatist idea, which in some sense is somewhere between the kind of objectivism of correspondence and the subjectivism of coherence. But basically it doesn't seem to work. And that's by its own standards. It's probably not true. On this slide I'm going to give you a very synoptic kind of view of how the teams line up in the truth wars. I've listed on each case a few of the key players for the last 2,000 years, and a sort of one-line summary of what you might think of as the key doctrine of each side. Those of you who know the sort of literature of the sort of 20th century literature, not just in philosophy but in comparative literature, for example, many other areas of popular culture, well, you'll probably recognize some of these names. And so you'll have a sense of what Blackburn is on about when he says that the culture wars have become the truth wars. The idea is that this debate about truth is really at the heart of a lot of debates in contemporary culture. Okay, but as I said, Blackburn, like quite a number of other people, thinks that in some sense we ought to just walk away from this great battle. And in some sense these two sides are fighting over nothing. And what I want to talk about in the next section is what Blackburn and other people see as the attractions of walking away. And a good place to start is with a quotation from, this is Gottlob Frege, a great German logician and philosopher and mathematician. And this quote is from very late in his life in 1918. Frege says, "It's worth noticing that the sentence, 'I smell the scent of violets,' has just the same content as the sentence, 'It is true that I smell the scent of violets.' So it seems that nothing is added to the thought by my ascribing to it the property of truth." His idea is that we don't add anything, we don't say anything different when we put on, "It is true that I smell the scent of violets," to what we say if I just say, "I smell the scent of violets." So Frege suggests, may we not be dealing here with something which cannot be called a property in the ordinary sense at all? Here's Blackburn's gloss of that idea. Blackburn says, "It's as though you could always look through 'it is true that' to identify the content judged or inquired after and so on, as if the reference to truth was not there." So it's this idea that adding "it's true that" on the front of a sentence in some sense doesn't make any difference. Another person who got onto this idea early in the 20th century was the brilliant young Cambridge philosopher Frank Ramsey, who died tragically young at the age of 26 in 1930, but not before he'd made seminal contributions not only to philosophy and mathematics, also to economics. Ramsey is known for what he called the redundancy theory of truth, the view that truth is redundant, it doesn't sort of add anything. And as you'll see, this is very similar to the idea that truth is transparent. So Ramsey says at one point, "There's really no separate problem of truth, but merely a linguistic muddle. It's evident that it is true that Caesar was murdered means no more than that Caesar was murdered, And it is false that Caesar was murdered means that Caesar was not murdered. Okay, so again the idea is that adding it is true that or it is false that doesn't really add anything. So there's no new subject matter introduced by talking about truth and falsity. It's just the old subject matter. And if that's the case, what's all the fuss about this question, what is truth? Now, Ramsey also has a very nice story about why, even though there's no subject matter introduced by truth, no new subject matter, it still can be, for various logical reasons, very handy to have such a device in language, and we didn't worry about what those reasons are. The important thing for present purposes is the idea that there's no separate subject matter of truth. And so there's, as it were, nothing to worry about, no subject which you could be thinking about if you're trying to address the question, what is truth? This is how Blackburn puts the point in his book. He says, both the relativist and the absolutist are impressed by Pilate's notorious question, what is truth? And each tries to say something useful at the same high level of abstraction. The minimalist, this is Blackburn's word for this person who takes this very thin, minimal, transparent view of truth, the minimalist can be thought of as turning his back on this abstraction. So, for example, Blackburn says, if the issue is whether high tide is at midday, then truth consists in high tide being at midday. If the issue is whether Blair is a fantasist, the truth lies in Blair being a fantasist or not. The point is to discourage us from looking for anything more general. Okay, so this is what Blackburn's recipe for peace in the truth wars looks like. It's to accept the redundancy or the transparency of point from people like Frege and Ramsey. In other words, to accept that it is true that P means nothing more or less than P. To give up looking for a general theory of truth, a general answer to Pilate's question, what is truth? And to walk away. Okay. Now, as I said at the beginning, in some ways I'm sympathetic to that, but in other ways, as I want to explain, I think it's a recipe for disaster. There's something we have to say first before we can walk away. Okay, let's forget about truth for the time being and think about exams. And I want to distinguish between two kinds of exams. They're both, in a sense, quite familiar. The first kind of exam is what we might call exam as test me. And this is the sort of exam you do where if you fill in one of those sort of self-examination questionnaires in a popular magazine, for example, where in a sense the point of the exam is to reveal something about you. So, roughly speaking, the aim of the exam is not to say that P or that P is true unless you actually believe that P. So the exam is sort of focusing on your beliefs. And I want to contrast that to a more familiar sort of exam in universities, the exam we think of as a test of knowledge, where the idea is that you're not supposed to say P unless it's actually the case that P.